don't block the path of inquiry. Don't lay down rules that make it impossible for people to ask important questions.
Welcome to the Thought Stretchers podcast, where we hope to stretch your thinking about important issues in education through rich inquiry. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm your host for these conversations for complexity and nuance. In this episode, I talked with Jim Heal and Rebekah Berlin, who are the authors of a new book titled Mental Models: How Understanding the Mind Can Transform the Way You Work and Learn. I really enjoyed this conversation because we got into some of the complexity and nuance that I'm generally looking for here. And speaking of nuance, we dived into the nuances of mental models, distinguishing them from schemas and emphasizing their role in both conceptual understanding and procedural application. We discussed the critical importance of knowledge as the foundation for critical thinking, addressing misconceptions around constructivism and the need for targeted inquiry. Jim and Rebekah shared how their book aims to bridge the gap between educational beliefs and evidence-supported practices and offered educators practical frameworks for improving in-the-moment decision-making and fostering deeper learning. We also touched on the application of mental models across different subjects, the power of varied examples in building rich schemas, and the science of elaborative interrogation for long-term memory. As always, I encourage you to visit our website, wegrowteachers.com, to learn more about our professional learning and professional development. I like to say that all of our work is through the lens of inquiry, but that intentionally includes takeaways from the evidence base of cognitive science. That means our work, including our project-based learning work, embeds what we call knowledge-rich inquiry through effective scaffolding and assessment. If you'd like to learn more about how we do that, our inquiry and PBL-related blog posts and related podcast episodes are useful resources, and you can find those by visiting wegrowteachers.com and clicking on the blogs and podcasts area in the top menu. Or you can reach out to me by email at drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And now here's my conversation with Jim and Rebekah. I am with Jim Heal and Rebekah Berlin, and we're going to talk about their new book, Mental Models: How Understanding the Mind Can Transform the Way You Work and Learn. I want to give both of you an opportunity to introduce yourselves, and then we'll introduce the book and kind of go from there. So why don't we do ladies first? Rebekah, why don't you introduce yourself, and then we'll get to Jim.
Yeah, I am Rebekah Berlin. And I am excited to talk with you today, Drew. I currently work in product development at an organization that helps educators improve teacher-child interactions. But prior to that, I worked with Jim at Deans for Impact, where I focused on teacher preparation. And prior to that, I was at University of Virginia, where I was getting my PhD, and before that I had some wonderful years in the classroom in Memphis, Tennessee.
Well, tell us a little bit more about the years in the classroom before we get to Jim. So
Yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah, I taught elementary school, so I taught second through fourth grade here in Memphis, Tennessee. I originally came to teaching through a program called Teach for America that brought me down to Memphis, and then I stayed and actually met my husband while he was also a teacher here, and we have a great community of educators here in Memphis.
Okay, so second through fourth grade. Just to put on the table, my daughter is just starting her elementary education certification program at, and so any advice that you have for her, we'll take off the air, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's perfect. Well, I'm obviously biased, but she made a great choice of age level.
Yeah, well, actually, she may want to go a little bit younger than second through fourth, but as you well know, sometimes you change your mind, and sometimes you have your mind changed for you. You get told what you're teaching, so
Yeah, exactly.
We'll
But
see how that plays out.
when I started, I couldn't wait to teach reading, and then my first job, I got hired as a mathematics only teacher. So I really hear that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Jim, let's hear more about you.
Yeah. Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Drew. I'm Jim Heal. I'll go reverse order to Rebekah, so I'll start early and come up to the here and now. I was a classroom teacher myself. Had the good fortune to be at the other end of the spectrum. So I was a high school English teacher. I then became a school leader in the UK. And about 10 years ago, I moved here to the US to pursue my doctoral studies here. As a result of that, I became increasingly aware and interested and concerned really about the gap that exists between research and practice. So I found myself working at an initiative run by Harvard University called Research Schools International, where we would go to different schools and school systems around the world and try to infuse some of those principles of the mind to think about what it means to be evidence informed. From there, joined Deans for Impact, where I came to know Rebekah and worked closely with her there, doing a lot of the same thing, but this time within the higher ed space, predominantly looking at how teacher preparation does or does not incorporate an understanding of how the mind works. Was then fortunate enough to start writing books just like Mental Models, working alongside Paul Kirshner, Carl Hendrick and others. Was involved in the writing of How Teaching Happens. Just released another book with them called Instructional Illusions. And obviously the book that we're here to discuss today, Mental Models. So just started my own organization as well called Learning Science Partners. Again, the drumbeat here is about trying to go into schools and school systems and fill that all important gap between what we think works and what we know works.
Well, you've got some connections to folks who have been on the podcast before. Paul, at least twice, I believe, and Carl has joined as well. And you know, I really appreciate Carl and the way that he talks about some of these things. And I'm glad you mentioned was How Teaching Happens, not How Learning Happens, right? Because I had forgotten that you were on that as well. And I think that's when I talked with Paul about those two books. So both I think are really important. And I'm wondering though, if Rebekah, you said you've moved on. Since moved on, was the writing of the book together the impetus for you leaving?
She couldn't work with me any longer.
I said only in one way. No. But I think we wrote the book because kind of to Jim's point, in the work we were doing together, we saw sometimes, and obviously not everywhere, there's so many amazing teacher prep and professional development and professional learning programs out there, but sometimes we saw a difference between what people kind of passionately believed or rallied around, and what are teaching practices that are kind of robustly supported by evidence. And I think, Drew, you have done such a lovely job of highlighting some of this, but sometimes that can be because the version of things that makes it out into the world is like so oversimplified that what people get really excited about may have come a long way from the kind of original research or design that supports it. And sometimes people end up talking past each other because they're familiar with different bodies of work. And so we wanted to create something that was just full of really clear, accessible language, like took decades of research in cognitive science and kind of distilled it down into really sticky, memorable frameworks that we think, whether you're an educator or working in education in general as a leader or at a professional learning organization, but that we think there's some clear mental models that will help guide your decision making and make you so much more effective at what you do. And so we wanted to make sure those were easily accessible to people.
So we're going to unpack the book here, but I think you're at least in some ways referring to some of the things that I do try to talk about here on the podcast. And thank you for the kind words, and check is in the mail. I I want to, the sort of us versus them tribalism kinds of things of sort of inquiry versus, more traditional kinds of teaching, I find to be, I mean, in some ways they're sort of boring. In some ways they're sort of exciting. Trying to bridge those gaps, as I think you're sort of referring to, I think is it's just absolutely essential. And not talking past each other and being willing to talk past, or not being willing to talk with each other, not past each other. So, I think it's, again, just sort of making my soapbox plea for folks to do that. I'm actually collaborating on a piece with Cindy Nebel. I don't know if you know Cindy, but she was on one of my salon podcast conversations, and we were talking about some of these issues, and we decided to write a paper, a piece that we're now getting some feedback on, and hopefully will be out to sort of try to help us move past some of these things that have been going on for quite some time. But anyways, all that said, what's the book about? You've kind of alluded to it now a little bit, but like, what do we mean by mental models? What exactly is meant to be explained there, and why do you think it's so important that teachers need to know about mental models?
Well, I can start in on that, and then Rebekah, feel free to add thinking as you go. I think one of the things that we noticed quite early on was that there is a difference between a mental model and schema. Now, I will caveat this by saying that a lot of the nuances here are still kind of up for grabs, and it's not necessarily entirely settled science. I think a lot of people are still kind of exploring what some of the more fine-grained distinctions are. But part of where Rebekah and I come at it from is this idea of the difference between kind of conceptual understanding versus sort of procedural guidance. So for instance, when we think about schema, we think about a kind of interconnected network of ideas, and the more you come to know about something and the more expert you become, it's not just that you know more things, but you know them in a connected way. You know them by virtue of how certain ideas relate to one another. You know things by virtue of their difference to other things, rather than just treating knowledge items as singularities. So they're sort of situated within a network of concepts. Mental models are in large part similar to that, but rather than offering just a kind of conceptual guide in terms of this is what there is to know about this thing, mental models offer also this kind of way of thinking about the doing of something, the idea that you don't just interact with the world by knowing stuff, but rather you interact with the world by knowing how to do stuff. And when a mental model is precise in your mind, it doesn't matter how simplistic it is. Rebekah has often used the example of even brushing your teeth, right? The idea that when you think about doing that activity, you can pause it at any time, you can rewind the tape, you can zoom in and out of various moments and parts of that activity. And in so doing, you become more attuned to what it means to do that activity with efficacy. Another distinction that we found that's really, really helpful is from the work of Sarah Cottinghat, who talks about how, if a schema is telling you what a supermarket is and all of the constituent features of a supermarket, a mental model is perhaps closer to saying, well, what do you do when you walk around a supermarket? You might start in one section and move to another. You first need to get the cart and be able to ready to use that, and so on and so forth. So our distinction is about, you need to know things and you need to know them in a connected way, but also mental models help us to indicate sort of how you procedurally work through something, which we think is a much more robust way of thinking about how to apply a set of concepts. But Rebekah, I'm sure you'll want to add onto that as well.
Yeah, I think where I think there's opportunity is I feel like often in education there's this push and pull between anyone who teaches math has I'm sure lived this, but between conceptual understanding or procedural fluency. And I think the power of mental models is the hybrid of an importance of both, because true procedural fluency, that might be every time you brush your teeth, you start on the lower left quadrant, you brush the front of your teeth first, then the back. You're following a step-by-step procedure, kind of the same way every time. But when that is also supported by deep understanding, the goal of a mental model is it gives you an idea of what the target performance is, and then allows you to flexibly make decisions in order to reach that. And so you're going to pull from both your procedural knowledge, your conceptual understanding, but the goal is kind of that ultimate performance. The thing that I always think about is like when I am cooking a dish, if I have a high quality mental model, I can imagine what I want it to taste like. And yes, I'm following a recipe with that kind of procedural guidance. Yes, I understand different things about all the ingredients, but I'm also going to make decisions along the way of like, oh, actually, I'm going to cut the heat earlier than what the recipe is saying because I'm noticing these particular cues, or I'm tasting as I go and being like, ooh, yikes, this is undersalted. I'm gonna drop some more salt in to get more of that taste I'm looking for. So the idea of a mental model is to help you understand what you ultimately want it to look like, sound like, taste like, exist in the world, and then be able to pull flexibly in order to get there.
So are there interesting or useful and important things to say about, because you've used knowledge a few times, and of course I think that knowledge is absolutely vital and important, and I appreciate the work of, I guess, maybe the science of learning movement writ large and sort of pushing that, because I do think, as I'm guessing you would agree, that the sort of more inquiry constructivist kinds of folks, of which I'm, maybe could be characterized as, have overlooked the importance of knowledge and the role of knowledge, and people can just Google things and say no. Well, they can, but that won't help them in lots of things that are important in teaching and learning and thinking. But the sort of relationship between knowledge and understanding, it seems to me like there's an important jump there in terms of the way that you've described mental models, and I'm just wondering if there's anything important or useful to say about the relationship of those things as they sort of relate to mental models.
Yeah, I can dive in. I mean, I've long thought about this relationship between kind of knowledge and understanding, and I'm aware, Drew, that there's a whole continuum of different ways of thinking about the way that knowledge plays a part. Something that I keep coming back to as a kind of anchor concept is this notion that you can't really think critically about nothing. You need to be able to have the raw material of knowledge items that you can then engage with in order to make sense of or move forward in your learning or development of something. In the same way that Rebekah was naming with her recipe example, yes, Rebekah can deviate from the recipe when the time comes to acknowledge that something might need to be done differently, but the recipe still needs to exist as a starting point, as a jumping off point, especially if she hadn't encountered that particular dish before. And so it seems to me that you need something to do something with, and therein lies the role of knowledge itself. The other thing that I'll say about constructivism is that I think in a large part, there's a kind of conflating or a confusion that's set in as far as constructivism is concerned, which is that primarily it's more a principle of the mind and how we make meaning than it is a principle of pedagogy and how we ought to teach. This idea that constructivism has come to mean this idea that students build knowledge on, build meaning in and of themselves, hasn't always sat comfortably with me. The idea that knowledge builds on knowledge is that sits with me much more comfortably, because it lifts the importance of knowledge as the building blocks with which we become more expert in something. Again, Rebekah, I don't know if you wanted to tack on there.
I think, and Drew, we may get more into this over the next hour. But I think that for me, some of these different things are like, what do we mean by knowledge? What do we mean by conceptual, and ensuring that we're using the same definition? Because I think there's I remember one of the first time I read one of the like seminal Sweller papers that that people used to argue against constructivism, and I was like, I've never in my life walked into a classroom and seen someone just hand people a box of materials and say like, okay, now create, like, where it's just like, that's not that's
pure discovery learning.
Yeah, what the high quality version is. And on the flip side, I've also heard kind of like diehard or people that like really kind of identify as part of the like the party of constructivism or different things like that, that
the tribe,
that have really kind of been like, there's no role for facts or procedural guidance, or there is no time for telling, and that is also thoroughly debunked and not a part of the literature. So I think with all of it, my experience, and especially Jim, I think our work in higher education, where I think there is an especially high value around the language of constructivism. Often when we moved away from like, what are we calling it, to what are we actually talking about, I found that there was so much overlap between like, what do we think high quality support of student learning looks like.
Mm. Well, one of the things that you mentioned there, Jim, you were talking about critical thinking, and I don't want to get us too far afield, and this may get us too far afield, so we may abandon this line of discussion. But the idea of critical thinking is something I've been ironically thinking critically about lately, and I completely agree with the importance of knowledge in critical thinking and doing it well and deeper. I think that we could probably find some examples of or ways in which somebody can think critically without much knowledge, but it just wouldn't be very deep or rich critical thinking. And you know, that's really not, it's neither here nor there, because obviously we want deep critical thinking, not just surface kind of critical thinking. But I wonder, you know, like I think it's true. It resonates with me. You know, I think it's Daniel Willingham who really sort of drives home the point of domain-specific critical thinking, and I think that that's so obviously true. It's you can see, you know, somebody who works in a science field uses a set of sort of maybe a mental model as a way to describe it, a way of sort of approaching and thinking through things, and procedures and methods of analysis and things like that. And so I think that that's really true. But then I also feel like there's a sort of discarding of the idea of sort of a more generalized critical thinking, that when somebody doesn't have knowledge about something, that are you able to figure out what you need to know in order to figure out how to solve a problem or do something. And so, again, I don't want to take us too far afield because it's not really what the book is about, but in some ways this is probably related. So I'm curious how you all think about that.
Drew, cut me off if I'm not actually answering your question. I think going back to what I said earlier about like, okay, vocabulary aside, what is the thing we're talking about, where I think the skill of assessing what do I know about this topic and what do I need to learn more about, that is something that there are kind of general study skills that someone can build, and there are like domain specific knowledge that would help someone do a better or worse job of that, especially when we think about the literature on expertise, and even the Kruger effect of unskilled and unaware, but often folks who are new to a domain typically rank their expertise and skill a lot higher than they would once they get even marginally more information about the topic. So I think that's like one set of things. But I also think under the banner of critical thinking, I feel like sometimes there's a focus on like higher order thinking questions, for example, which if you think about the cognitive science literature, a lot of those questions are the exact types of prompts for deep processing that we know helps information move from working memory to long-term memory and support the encoding process. And that's true whether someone is a novice in a topic or an expert. I think the difference is if we were talking about the addition sentence, 1 + 3 = 4, I might have a visual representation and ask you of like 1 cube and 3 cubes, and I might say like, how does each symbol in this equation map onto to the cubes below? And I would want you, Drew, to be able to walk me through each number, each symbol, and kind of what they each mean. We'd be starting by giving you some information, and then the critical thinking or the high cognitive load is about making sense of the relationship between them. But I think you see across the cognitive science literature, whether it's about supporting encoding, whether it's about effective modeling or worked examples, rarely are those things effective just on their own. Their kind of most effective supercharged form is almost always when there are questions that support deep processing embedded in them. And I think a lot of times like that is called something different in the cognitive science literature, but like would also be under the banner of critical thinking, as many people I've encountered talk about it.
Yeah, Jim, anything you want to add to that?
No, again, I'll do a shout out to Dan Willingham, as you did earlier, Drew, and say, you know, one of the things that he has long stated that stuck with me for the longest time is this idea of understanding is remembering in disguise, and the idea that for the most part, even when we have scant initial information to go on, whenever we're thinking critically, somewhere inside at a cognitive level, we are saying, I've seen something like this before. Like that, otherwise we would just be, born afresh each day, and even brushing our teeth or getting to our car would prove, a multi-hour endeavor. So I think that, again, I love this idea that we're looking at the nuance between the nomenclature and the idea that part of where this nuance lives is this notion that we have to have some sense of something in order to do what we will with that thing. There's that great study of Chase and Simons with the chess players from the early 70s, where they asked them to remember, and it was only when the grandmasters had chessboards that looked like real games of chess that they were able to memorize them flawlessly when they were asked to remember where the pieces were. But when those same chessboards were covered with pieces that were in unlikely positions that would normally not appear in a real game of chess, those grandmasters were not able to remember the positionality of them with any greater accuracy than us mere mortals who don't play chess quite as well. And so again, like it's connected to what we're saying, because we need to be able to acknowledge that even our ability to remember things, let alone to encounter them meaningfully, is so deeply connected to and reflected in the prior knowledge that we hold in relation to a given thing. And so for my part, at least, combined with what Rebekah was naming, that is why I would I die on the hill of knowledge as at least being an entirely necessary part, not sufficient for everything that's required. You still need to be able to do something with it, but I think that knowledge is the thing with which you can do things.
Yeah, I often say knowledge is necessary but not sufficient, and so maybe similar to what you said there.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Rebekah, you were talking, give an example in math, which certainly is fine. But I wonder, and I was thinking as you were talking. So I have a junior in high school, my youngest daughter, and she's was meant to be halfway through the book The Jungle by today. So this weekend there was some. Let's say some decisive parenting going on, and trying to help her also not just read, but make some sense of it, right? To make meaning of it. And to your point, both of your points is, the knowledge of some of the things that are sort of themes of the book, like capitalism, and asking her, what is capitalism? Can you explain capitalism for me? Because this is a sort of theme, and without understanding and having that knowledge, one might understand the story just in general, but not really the depth of it. And I think that gets to the point. But it also brings up, and I'm curious, Jim, as you said you were a high school English teacher, one of the things that what seems clear to me in my sort of back and forth and conversations with, the sort of tribalism of one end of the spectrum versus the other, is a lot of the sort of more vocal advocates of science of learning kinds of things tend to use math as examples and be math teachers and such like that. And I was a social studies teacher, so I tend not to think in math terms. And it seems almost like there are two different, almost, maybe mental models of the way that we might think about teaching and learning and thinking. Because obviously math is something that builds upon one another. It's algorithmic. It's, all of those kinds of things. Whereas a social studies or humanities teacher, an English teacher, you're talking about really big kinds of questions. Not that there aren't small details and granular knowledge and things that are more algorithmic in some ways. But I'm curious, do you see how do you see your experience as an English teacher and sort of teachers of humanities and bigger sort of, I don't even know how to describe it, softer kinds of academic content in terms of situated in sort of mental models and knowledge and cognitive science?
Yeah, it's a really powerful question. I think that for one, at least, I think the idea of the way in which we explore the literature on this, I think we've been lulled into believing that it's kind of monolithic, and that the difference between different domains is sort of inconsequential. In reality, we know that so many of these studies, even broad-based studies, some of them are grounded in, say, mathematical knowledge or mathematical kind of functions, as you say, and ways of thinking about that more procedurally and algorithmically. And so to assume that we can just copy and paste that into a whole range of different disciplines is not necessarily the right way to go. But at the same time, as is sort of seems to be one of our themes about the nuance here, is to go too far in the other direction and assume that non-math related subjects or less quote unquote technical subjects aren't still sort of helped by that. From the point of view of an English teacher, I can certainly say, if I put a text down in front of a group of students who have been studying a certain style for a particular length of time, or have been studying certain authorial kind of moves and techniques, they're going to say, oh, I've seen a simile before. I know what similes tend to do. And so therefore I can be on the lookout for how this particular simile is working in this moment. Or I've spent the last 6 weeks exploring how, let's say, postmodern, novels are constructed. And now when you present me with one, I have some notion of the the norms and the rules of the road for how such texts have tended to organize themselves at that point in the evolution of the form. And so again, it might be to a certain degree a slipperier way of thinking about it, but at the same time, again, I am drawing on that conception of what it is that I think I'm seeing, regardless. It might just be harder to look at the fine grain moments of when and how and where I'm doing just that.
And I think, Drew, with the example you gave of the jungle, if we think about like the to your point, the role of knowledge in understanding, in terms of kind of reading comprehension, there's a difference between asking who wrote The Jungle or what year was The Jungle written, and why was The Jungle such a controversial novel at the time it was written, or like why was this considered like a breakthrough novel at that time? That is a higher order question, but in order to answer it, there has to be knowledge at play, whether the teacher is, I think in many US curriculums that that have been labeled as high quality instructional materials by organizations like Ed Reports or things like that, there's very intentional pairing of informational texts with major works of literature to build that background knowledge to ensure that that young or young adult readers can access to your point, the really powerful themes inside the text, and not just have it roll off and be like, wow, there's a lot of butchering meat in this.
Yeah. My daughter has noted some of those details, and
I will add that you kind of buy one get one free in this regard, because to use Rebekah's example, if you were simply to ask what year it was written versus the significance of that year, not only is that a higher order question that invites more meaningful processing, as a result of that, it also means you're more likely to remember the year in which it was written. So you, because of that depth of encoding, you're both using knowledge to make sense, but you're also more reliably likely to encode information when you ascribe meaning to it. So it kind of benefits on both ends of the process, I suppose. Is
right. Well, the book has quite a bit we're not going to cover, but cognitive load and working memory and structure of long-term memory. One of the things that jumped out to me as I was reading it is, I guess, chapter 3 or module 3 or part 3? You got parts in, anyways. 3, which is more is more, build rich schemas via varied examples. And I'm wondering if one of you might sort of unpack this idea of varied examples and why that's helpful in terms of schemas and mental models.
Yeah. I think the big headline I would hope people will take away about varied examples is that humans are not great at generalizing, and we tend to overgeneralize, and that we, most of what we know or what we think we know is directly informed by what we've seen most often. And so to help people develop a more expansive sense of the world, we want to give them varied examples so that they're not making incorrect generalizations. I think I don't know why I'm using so many cooking metaphors today, but an example that that I think we use in the book is if you there's several studies that have shown that the example that comes to mind is whatever you've seen most often. So if I were, Drew, to say the word herb to you, what would spring to mind is kind of whatever herbs you've encountered most often. You and I both live in the middle of the country, so that might be parsley, that might be basil, that might be but it's probably less likely to be salad burnet, which is like a cool weather cucumber tasting herb. But if we were to give you from a young age, or to your when you first start exploring a topic, several different examples of something under the same conceptual umbrella, and then ask you, why is this also an example of an herb, or that would cause you to tune into the deep structure and understand the similarities between all these different, I'm in deep on the herbs right now, but all these different examples of herbs that might look really different. They might be different colors, they might be different shapes, but tune into kind of what makes an herb an herb.
Yeah. Well, now we've got to get into some recipes and cooking.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. And so one of the pieces that I've got noted and highlighted, and I'll try to read some of it, probably not all of it, says, so how do we help someone deeply understand the deep structure of a concept? We provide them several varied examples and then ask them questions to help them identify the deep structure. And of course, as an inquiry advocate, I'm like, oh, okay, you have my attention. And you give an example of a hook and loop, a burr and a piece of Velcro, and then say these two items appear different on the surface, but they are actually very similar. You said they both sometimes stick to stuff if you don't want them to. Why is that? What structural similarities do they share? They don't stick to everything. What do the things they stick to have in common? And so all of this, sort of questioning to sort of get, and I would say sort of lead thinking in ways that can deepen the learning. And it's funny to me because when I encounter folks who are often really sort of staunch and loud advocates of cognitive science and science of learning, and whatever that tribe wants to be called, or we want to call it, the word inquiry is almost like a bad word, right? And as you mentioned, Rebekah, earlier, it's almost maybe a different word in cognitive science that doesn't exactly translate or something, but it strikes me as obviously true that inquiry is a big piece of cognitive science and a big piece of the ways in which we make meaning of things and deepen learning, which is not the same as inquiry-based learning, and certainly is not the same as discovery learning. So I'm curious how you would describe, Jim, we'll start with you, describe, the role of inquiry in these sort of mental models and building knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, again, I think it's I don't want to harp on too much about knowledge for its own sake in this particular conversation, but to further Rebekah's point about rich and varied examples of things, I think our question becomes, what is the nature of the inquiry, and in what way is the teacher creating the conditions in which inquiry is taking place at the right level, with the right level of meaning, and directed at the right concept or series of concepts. One could easily engage in a set of examples of things that only ever deal with the surface phenomena of those things, and never get to the underlying architecture of something. I think we often do this, both in the real world and in classrooms. We'll say, such and such is just like riding a bike. Well, actually, when you strip the surface, is it, or is it just a convenient and, dare I say it, sort of lazy comparison? But once you peel away the layers, does it survive translation into what it actually means? And therefore, the metaphor or the means, the entry point to the idea, continues to be of use, as opposed to, if the connection is tangential and it never goes any deeper than that tangential connection, then what are you inviting inquiry around. What is inquiry driving towards? And the best teachers I've seen, they say, it's almost like they're saying to themselves, I'm going to paint these kids into a corner where the only way out of that corner is through the ideas that I want them to think about, at least as relates to the terms of this lesson or the objectives. And I'm going to ensure that they think about them with a requisite degree of inquiry that means that it isn't just skimming off the surface. Again, like you said earlier, Drew, like there's so much tribalism here. It's another example of like, are you in the student-centered or the teacher-led camp? Well, actually, that's an example of where it can be both. I'm leading a part of the process that says I'm going to hold you accountable for real depth of inquiry, but also I'm centering you by saying, here are the means by which you can do that. Now go and, knock it out the park. And so I think we can walk and chew gum at the same time as it relates to those things.
Yeah. And when I'm working with teachers, and I think the evidence shows this, the idea that you would use inquiry, and I think you're referring to this, should be guided, just like anything. Are they ready for it? Is it too cognitively complex? Is it actually bringing you to the place where you want them to think and learn? And I do think that again, it can be a little lazy. Sometimes teachers think, oh, this is fun, this is interesting, and it's a flashy thing. And then first of all, are the students learning and thinking in the ways that are important? And probably more importantly, are they learning the things we want them to learn and think? Because it can very easily go astray there. Moving forward in, I guess, chapter 5, one of the things that I circled, which I think is related here, is the science of elaborative interrogation. And again, that piqued my interest as an inquiry advocate, because I think that's something it's so obviously important. Maybe Rebekah, you can handle this one and kind of unpack what do we mean by the science of elaborative interrogation.
Yeah, I think, and this is where Drew, to your point, and Jim, with what you were saying of like, I feel like the big question in my mind is always like, okay, aside from what we're calling it, it's like, to what end? And the science of elaborative interrogation is really about ensuring that people can remember what you want them to remember later, whether that is information, whether that's concepts, whether that's a process, that if you leave that to chance, and it's in working memory, and then you're just like, I sure hope it makes it the long-term memory.
Right.
I mean, maybe that'll work some of the time, but there's no guarantees. Whereas research really consistently shows that that deep processing about the thing that you want people to remember is associated with easier retrieval and longer memory later. There's several reasons for that, and we can get into that. But the big thing that I would want people to take away, especially in the context of the larger conversation we're having, is like, if you prompt people to think deeply about something, they are probably going to remember that later. And so, to your point, sometimes where we have these wildly open-ended tasks or activities that where kids have not been accurately scaffolded in, or their attention isn't focused on the particular things the educator is hoping they take away, then yes, they are going to walk out of that experience remembering something, because they will have thought deeply about how come she got pink cardboard and I got blue, or like, I really wanted the glitter and it's over at that table, and like, how do I get over there in time to? There will be things that that children and students will think deeply about, but it's about to Jim's point about painting them into a corner, but targeting that thinking about the most important information. And so with elaborative interrogation, there have been both studies on questions that prompt deeper processing, like why and how questions are associated with longer memory than questions that tune learners into surface features, like how many letters are in this word versus what does this word actually mean and can you use it in a sentence. But then there's also studies around the kind of structure of memory, that when you answer a why or how question, because you're going to have to explain more, kind of back to our question about what year was The Jungle written versus why was that book controversial in the year that it was written. I'm going to have to say so much more to answer that question. I'm going to have to pull from so much more prior knowledge that if you think about that, like each of those pieces of knowledge I'm pulling are like little hooks attached to them, then there's so many more ways for me to remember that information later. There's just answering the year, I've got one path for retrieval, but with that longer elaborated response, I've now built a much more robust network to access that information later.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that maybe I'm just seeing a too narrow version of art and studying science and science sort of advocacy. What seems like I see a lot of, and again, this is not something that we shouldn't be doing. It's not unimportant, but sort of flashcards and that kind of retrieval practice, which again, certainly a place for that. There's times where that can be really helpful. We do want students to know things and remember things. I tell teachers that all the time, and again, get on my soapbox about that. But the power of elaborative interrogation, the inquiry questioning, the ways in which we can use those tools. Bruce Robertson does some really good work around this as well. I had him on the podcast, and power of questioning. To the way it just is such a powerful retrieval practice tool, because as you're mentioning, the deeper ways in which we think about something gives us more cues to pull it back. And so not just doing sort of review questions, but the work of Ron Richhart and Jim, you talk about Harvard and Project Zero from Harvard and Cultures of Thinking, which I think is really great stuff, is constructive questions, generative questions, facilitative questions, those kinds of questions that do foster that, coupled with explicit instruction and explanations and clarity of concepts and facts and knowledge. And so I don't even know if there's probably not a question there, but just to sort of agree with you wholeheartedly and sort of drive home the importance of that. So would this be a mental model? This is something, as I was reading, I was thinking about, and I'm curious if you would think about this as a mental model, or if you would describe it as something different. We talk about I think it's the expertise reversal effect, and, we've got novice and moving them to experts, and, knowledge and explicit instruction as being a big part of that. And oftentimes in conversations I have with folks, it's said, and again, I don't think this is necessarily wrong. I think it's just one way to think about it, is that we start with explicit instruction, and then you move into, as they become more expert, you move into using more inquiry and getting into maybe elaborative interrogation. It seems to me, though, that the use of inquiry to start before you get into that explicit instruction could be and can be and often is, if done well, big caveat there, big qualifier, to sort of create almost like a mental model, a sort of schema or idea of the sort of bigger picture of what we might be studying and thinking about and learning about in this unit, or maybe extended lesson. And if we can use inquiry in a way to sort of create some of those hooks, just sort of mentally, and then get into the explicit instruction, then again, moving as they become more knowledgeable, more expert, getting back into those generative questions, those kinds of questions that are elaborative, that that mental model, and again, excuse me if I'm using that word and it doesn't fit here, but that's kind of how I thought about it, is if we can use inquiry to sort of create that sort of visual mental model in somebody's head, that as they're going through the learning process, that they would be better able to sort of place that in a sort of conceptual map. And boy, I'm just throwing all kinds of terms at you, but I'm curious again, does that make sense? Would it be a mental model? Would it be something? It's probably something else, and apologies for using mental models about 15 times there, probably incorrectly.
One of the ways I might come at this is to say, learners are going to activate prior knowledge of any description, whether we like it or not. The question becomes, is the prior knowledge that they're activating, be that in the form of schema or a mental model? Let's just sort of square that for now as a prior for this point. They're going to activate it regardless. So if you begin with inquiry, and that inquiry is entirely open-ended, and that inquiry could go truly anywhere, whether or not it happens to be in relation to what's coming next or not, then I would argue that you are leaving to chance whether or not every student is going to use that time in a way that is going to adequately prepare them for what's to come. If, on the other hand, you said to that group of students, well, listen, do you remember last unit we explored such and such? And in many ways, this unit uses that some of the concepts from last time as a jumping off point. What I'd like you to do to begin with, just to see how it plays out, is to say, what do you expect might be true of this concept based on what we learned about this prior connected concept? To me, that's a reasonable ask, because you're still asking them to do something with whatever water has already gone under the bridge. If you do and again, I'm not caricaturing what you said here, Drew, in any way, but if you simply gave them a blank piece of paper and said, we're about to do X, what do you think of X before we get into the nuts and bolts of X? I would say, purely as a matter of efficiency and of utility, that probably is not going to be in any way useful or meaningful, at least not to the to be remembered content that you want to then go on to explore.
Rebekah, anything you want to add there?
Just that, Jim, we were on the same page. I was like, I think, Drew, what you're referencing is we would want a teacher to have an effective mental model for how to, or we want them to have a mental model for how to effectively activate prior knowledge. And like, I think that that all three of us would be aligned that like a really effective way to do that would be to ask targeted questions that elicit that knowledge, and that the prior knowledge that the teacher might want to activate is potentially like different than what kids would expect. Like if I'm in a science lesson and we're about to talk about the different parts of a cell, and I know that one of the roles of one part of the cell is to like remove waste from the cell, I might activate prior knowledge around like, where do we put our trash in the class, or things like that. But there, I also do agree with Jim about the role of efficiency, because classroom time is incredibly limited, and I have seen open-ended exercises designed to elicit prior knowledge that took an entire lesson where there were probably 4 things that came out that were actually relevant to the content to be learned. And if the teacher had been very targeted with their questions, the kids could have gotten there in about 4 minutes, and then had time to really dig deep and to the point of this conversation, really engage in kind of heavy cognitive lifting around the content to be learned and ensure that that made it into long-term memory.
Yeah, and efficiency, I think, it's definitely important. I sometimes wonder if is it always the most important priority, and I think that varies from school to school, class to class, and but shouldn't be overlooked. So, like a couple examples that might be maybe helpful, maybe not. So, for example, like if I ask students, I want you to ponder and think about this, because as a precursor to what we're going to learn about, which is federalism and branches of government and checks and balances, does the executive branch have too much power in the United States right now? And giving them an opportunity to sort of think through that. And again, to your point, Jim, if they don't have prior knowledge or any understanding about it, then what are we doing here? Having tried to do that, teach government to ninth graders as opposed to seniors, it was very clear very quickly that they didn't have that prior knowledge. They didn't have much to do with the government and interactions, and seniors, while not known for their great wisdom and thoughtfulness, certainly more than ninth graders. And so, you would say, all right, well, what do we need to know? What are the questions one needs to understand or think about? We need to know what the three branches of government are, the checks and balances, how they work, Congress, judicial branch, so on and so forth. So something like that. Or another example, having them generate questions. I don't know if you're familiar with the question formulation technique, but basically give them a question focus, which is a prompt that then from there you would generate questions. So a statement that would lead you into learning lesson or unit, like Miranda rights always protect the rights of the accused, and getting them to generate questions from there, and then using that as sort of the precursor or sort of setting the scene for the learning that you're going to do that would be targeted, would be those things. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about. And I don't know if that adds any useful clarity, or how you think, anything to add there.
Well, no, certainly I still think that technically, categorically comes under the banner of prior knowledge, and it also acknowledges that not all prior knowledge is equally useful to the task at hand. Again, the question becomes, is the comparison or the prior knowledge example that you might draw upon a tangential way of thinking about the relationship between those ideas, or does it actually stand a chance of making meaningful sense? So let's say that school that you were describing, or the classroom you were describing, that there is a school-wide set of structures around student leadership and governance, and that those structures themselves have perhaps some balance of power, or at least balance of jurisdiction. It could be that there's one committee that deals with purely academic issues, and another that deals with, school amenities or things like that. For me, that could begin to be something that says, oh, interesting, like not all power is held in either equally across domains, nor is it held equally across functions, nor is it held equally across even the level of power and influence that is exerted. Now we're thinking about power as something that has an interrelatedness, and that there's one form of power that may not sit squarely and be equivalent to the other. Like those kinds of things feel like they are a more reasonable jumping off point. Of course, you're not going to go in and say, well, we all know about the governing structures of Venezuela. How are they similar or different to the US? And so there's a way, again, as we've been saying a few times already, the devil is in the detail, and the nuance, the checks and balances, if you'll pardon the phrase, that a teacher would have to go through would be to say to themselves, what is it that I want students to learn? How do I intend to get them there? As in, what is the kind of thing that's analogously important for them to understand, or the kind of prior knowledge that I can capitalize on? And then how am I going to bridge the gap between what they already know and what I want them to come to know? Like these are for Rebekah and I, foundational questions that are oftentimes not asked of teachers, don't ask of themselves, similarly, when I go into a classroom, I almost always, if I go up to a student, will say something along the lines of, what are you working on? What would it look like to get better? And how are you getting there? You know, like if a student can't answer those three questions, or at least have a fair shake at seeing what the answer to those three questions are, you're still, I would be left wondering whether or not that student had a chance of success.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it is always about mapping that, and even the role of prior knowledge is not exempt from those kinds of questions we should ask of our own practice.
Yeah, I think sometimes I use the term cognitive path. Do as a teacher, do you have an idea or mental model of the cognitive path you want students to travel, having clarity on that, right? I break it down into 3 buckets of engagement, which behavioral, academic, cognitive, intellectual, whatever, all of those things, not just behavioral engagement. And then thinking, are they thinking about the things you want them to think about and in the ways you want them to think about? And then learning, are they learning the things you want them to learn? And I like Hattie's surface, deep, and transfer, but you can use other frameworks as well. And if those 3 things are in place, then I think you're in pretty good shape. So,
and Drew, like I think that framework you just described is so powerful and is a great mental model for. I think the big thing that we'd hope teachers who read the book take away is it's about making better informed decisions. So with like that kind of question generation exercise that you described, and you talked about the difference in your experience between 9th graders and 12th graders, what we'd want is for a teacher to be able to do what you did. If you launched into that exercise and the first question you got is, hey, like a student turning to another student and saying, hey, Miranda, is this about you? When it's about you, right? Like that's a signal of like,
that's a formative assessment.
Like, reverse. I painted the frame way too big here. We need to zoom in and target these questions a lot more. But I think this is all about kind of improving our in the moment decision making. As a teacher, we want people making sound decisions about how they support students in learning. And Jim and I's opinion is that like we're able to do that faster and make better choices if we understand how thinking actually occurs. And so the mental model we'd want teachers to have is we'd want them to have a mental model for how to appropriately activate prior knowledge and why we do that. What's the outcome for learning? We'd want them to have a mental model of alignment and to your point, Drew, of like, what is the thing I want them to learn and how do I ensure that we're staying on track with that? And what are the pivots I'm going to need to make along the way? So there's several mental models that we think are really important for educators to have to be able to do that exact work that you just described of an expert teacher.
Yeah, and I know I'm mindful of time, so I want to wrap us up here. But it's a short book, and there are definitely some other things I would love to talk about, and maybe we'll talk about sometime. But I want to make sure that you guys have a chance to share links and places they should get it. Anything else that we didn't talk about that you want to talk about? I think it's so important and I think your book is a good example of this. Just ways in which teachers can think about thinking and learning and teaching, and they may disagree with some things and agree with some things, and that's part of why we have reflective conversations and keep reading, and hopefully then have conversations with peers and colleagues and all those kinds of things. So the book is Mental Models: How Understanding the Mind Can Transform the Way You Work and Learn. And I'm sure you can probably tell us where to find it and any other links and, again, things you want to mention that we haven't mentioned already.
Yeah, I can give the sales spiel. So yeah, I think primarily, Rebekah, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that Amazon is one of the first ports of call here. It's published by Hachette Learning. And that is another way that you could approach if you don't necessarily want to hand over your $bucks to Mr. Bezos. I think again, one thing I'll just leave folks with as a final thought from me is we really wanted to write the book in terms of walking the talk. And so we think of, in a sense, mental models sort of is as mental models does. And so every chapter is that opportunity to give people, whether they're teachers or that they're leading any kind of learning, just something they can hold in their hand. That is an opportunity for them to go into an environment that is already almost immeasurably complex and have means by which they can say, okay, when it comes to elaborative interrogation, when it comes to managing cognitive load, when it comes to activating prior knowledge, I've got something I can hold and use, and it adds a qualitative value to what I'm doing without necessarily adding quantitative value where it's like I have to do more. It's not about more, it's about refining the models that you have in your mind that are already there. And we believe, and the reason we wrote the book, is that any of those mental models are, it's not only possible to refine them, but they are ripe for the refining.
Okay, Rebekah, anything you want to add to that?
I would just add that, Drew, I'm not sure when this is going to come out, but we've got a free webinar we're doing on October 2nd.
It will be out before then.
Well, perfect. The webinar is at 4:30 Eastern, and it's available to sign up on the Hatchet Learning website. And Drew, I'm gonna drop that link in the chat in case you want to share that with
Yeah. We'll put links to Amazon and Hatchet Learning and all of those kinds of things. Social media or any other sites or things you want to share before we get going?
You can find Jim and I both on LinkedIn, and you can find content related to our book at Mental Models at Work on LinkedIn, and then you can also find Jim on Twitter.
Okay, well, and
we're regular speakers at conferences, so we're likely to be next year at one of Research Ed, which I know is happening in New York in the sort of springtime of next year, and also Learning in the Brain, which is another quite large conference that brings together folks from our line of work. So we would strongly recommend people to sort of keep an eye out for those sorts of conferences as well. We just think they're generally a good introduction point to a lot of these ideas.
All right, and you also mentioned you've got another book coming out, or is it out yet now? Instructional Illusions?
It is. I'm holding it in my hand. Instructional Illusions with Paul Kirshner and Carl Hendrick, and this is about the things we think work and how oftentimes it might not necessarily tell the full picture unless you lift the veil and use your understanding of evidence to see what's really going on behind the curtain.
Well, I would be remiss to mention, I mentioned this, I think, on social media, but again, my daughter is in an elementary education program, first class she's taking. She sent me a slide deck, and one of the slides was dispelling the myth of learning styles. And so when people say teacher preparation is just not preparing students and they're spreading all these myths, I can point and say at least one of them is not.
No, that's incredibly exciting. And just exciting for the educators, exciting for kids.
All right.
Yeah, I hope your daughter. I know she will almost certainly keep flying that flag. So it's good to hear that that's happening.
All right. Well, thank you all, both of you, for the conversation. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this is great.
Thank you, Drew.
What we need to do is spend enough time together that we can start to translate our ideas into each other's language and include one another in this community of inquiry. And that is the work of love.